Hello my friends, welcome back to Refit and Sail, also known as the best S&S34 refit channel on all of the intervals. In this episode we're going to be continuing the works on this boat. This is part 2 of the Osmosis treatment series. So in this episode we're going to be drying out the laminate here in my workshop. Behind me, hopefully you now have a better view of the S&S34. This one was built in 1971 and sadly, like lots of boats that were built in the 70s and 80s and even in the 90s, the resins used in the layup weren't perhaps as good as they are today, and this boat unfortunately suffers from a very, very damp bottom and osmotic blistering. It was really localized on the port side. It wasn't all over, but we're doing a complete job because the owner wants this boat to be chef kiss perfect. It is his forever boat and he wants to get it ready so that when he is retired he has a beautiful craft to go sailing far and wide on. The S&S34 is a legendary plastic classic. If you want to know a bit more about it, go back and see the previous episode where we gave you a little bit more of an introduction to this boat, and we also then peeled it, we media blasted it, and then we did lots and lots of washing before bringing it around here into my workspace so we can get it dried, get the surface rebuilt and finished off. As you can probably see, there are some other works going on as well, which will hopefully be the subject of some other videos. The top sides are getting repainted, the tow rails are being replaced, and I expect there'll be a few other bits and bobs along the way. If you haven't seen the show before, my name is George Isted. I run a yacht refit and repair business called the Solent Boat Butler based in the central south of the UK, and I also share what I do both on client boats and on my own boats on Refit and Sail here for your enjoyment. So do stay along for the ride. If you haven't done so already, give me a thumbs up, press the subscribe button. I have to say that it is the YouTube. The other thing about YouTube is it's really annoying losing all your pre-recorded episodes, and I'm recording this for the second time because I went sailing at the weekend on my own boat. It was quite windy, my camera got quite wet, and the SD card corrupted. So I'm having to record this entire episode all over again. So some of the stuff you're seeing has already been done. Before we get onto the equipment and the process, let's just have a little walk around the boat. So this is the peeled surface. This has also been dried now using the heat and vacuum mats. So that's largely CSM, you can see there, and it's largely dry now. On that side above the waterline, that is unsanded, painted top sides there, and the sanding has started down here. That isn't down to the gel coat yet, but we are getting there. Walking around, we've had to do various repairs on the bottom. There are a few seacocks that we are relocating. The rudder's obviously off and that will be dried separately. Give you a view as far back as I can go. There is the transom. We've just taken the name off the transom. The boat's called Moonraker, but we've taken the name off so that the transom can be sanded for its repaint. And you can see the bottom laminate there is all peeled. This side has not yet been dried. And if I go back, you can see it's part sanded and part not sanded on the top sides there. The boat's obviously been in the wars. You know, this is an old boat now. It's had a few prangs and a few repairs over the years. And there's a little bit of filling and fairing we're going to have to do before the repaints, but that is not the subject of this video. Right folks, I've just taken the insulation off of this to show you one in place. So this is one of my heat and vacuum pads which I use for drying out the hull. Why do I use that? Well, heat helps things dry out. Vacuum lowers the boiling point of the stuff that we're trying to get out of the laminate. So between the two, they do a really, really effective job of drying out the whole laminate in super quick time. And we'll come on to the other ways that you can dry out the laminate in a minute, but I just wanted to show you one in place. So we have a vacuum hose that goes onto here. There's a valve there, and I've got a temperature sensor here, so that's built into the pad, and you have to think about where you are positioning that temperature sensor when you put the pad on. There's vac tape all the way around the outside, and if I stuck my vac pump on, again, this would suck itself back into the hull. This is actually left on here from Friday. It's now Monday morning, and I'm going to have to peel these off and get them to work in a new position fairly soon. In fact, let's take the small one off and we'll get it all set up on the bench. Well folks, here's the mat that I just removed. I say mat pad, silicone heat pad, whatever you want to call it. This is the smallest one that I have, so it's the easiest one to get on the hull. I've got two much larger ones, and they're great because they do big surface areas in one go, but if you've got a lot of curvature in the hull, or you're on your own and you're trying to put it on upside down, it is quite challenging. I'm going to buy some more at some point. They're quite expensive, and I'm probably going to go for a size that's somewhere in between this and my big ones, although the small ones are really useful. As I pointed out already, it has a temperature sensor in there, which feeds information to the controller here. There's just a single hole in this one with a valve on it, so you can put your vacuum hose onto there. Using the timer, I can set what temperature I want this to get to, and it will bring it up to that temperature and hold it at that temperature for as long as I want it. I can either have it on constantly, or I can set a timer on this as well. So in theory, I could set it off and walk away, but I generally speaking never do, because there's always a risk that something could go wrong. When you're placing these on the hull, you have to be very careful about thinking what's on the inside of the hull, particularly if you've got anything like insulation for a fridge or something like that. If you have this bit of the pad where the temperature sensor is on an uninsulated bit, and this bit of the pad on a bit of hull that has insulation on the inside, in theory that area could get very hot whilst this area is still under the temperature that you set it to, and then you could burn the laminate. So you have to be super careful, and even if there isn't insulation on it, you get things like the internal structure of the boat, you get stringers, you get bulkheads, you get things glassed in, and they effectively insulate the inside of the boat. So I always go over the pads with a heat gun, a temperature sensor gun, one of those infrared jobbies, and I monitor it until the whole thing is up to temperature, and then once I know it's up to temperature, there aren't any hot spots on it, I will then put insulation on it and I can walk away for a bit. I can then come back, because obviously insulation makes it hotter, but I'll peel back the insulation, check it again a few times, and then in theory I might walk away for half an hour or something like that and go and do something else. But I do monitor these when they're on the boat, because if it goes wrong, it can go very badly wrong. You have been warned if you try it. In terms of sticking these onto the hull, you simply use vacuum tape. Vac tape is used when you're backing down laminate, or backing down veneer onto a piece of wood, or whatever it is that you're doing. You use vac tape to seal up what you are trying to do, because if you can't pull a vacuum, then you're not lowering the boiling point of all the nasties in the hull. And it comes on a reel like this. You simply stick it on to the pad around the outside, and then when you're ready, you pull the backing paper off and you stick the pad to the hull. The other thing you do is check either before, but almost certainly afterwards, once you've got the vac pad on the hull, go on the inside of the boat and I have a little look around, and check that there's nothing that would get damaged by being resting against the hot hull, because the hull does get hot on the inside, and two, again, just checking for structure, checking for issues, anything like that. And I'll take my temperature sensor gun thing up onto the boat and wave it around and work out where the edges of the pads are, and just check that it isn't going to cause any problems putting the heat into the hull of the boat. So let's get this vac tape all the way round, and then I'll set it up on the boat and get it going. There. BEA. Beautiful. A little bit later in this episode, you are going to see these lovely things here, which are my extra long arms I've had made for my wheeled cradle, that were made by Wilks Engineering and Machinery, who are kindly sponsoring this episode. Adrian, who runs Wilks, is a sailor, and the team there make the fully adjustable shore-fast cradles that suit boats from 21 to 48 feet, along with custom work like these things here, or even, I imagine, a full custom cradle like I have got here on wheels. In addition to cradles, the team at Wilks also make and hold stock of a number of specialist items which they machine in-house. Here's an example. So this is an original Selden mast step that has very badly corroded all the way through and deformed, and here is their anodized aluminium machined replacement that is absolutely lovely. That would be a direct replacement for this Selden fitting here. And another example is this here. This is a Contessa 28 tiller hood fitting. So this goes at the top of your rudder stock for your tiller to attach to. Beautifully machined as a replacement to this rather grotty old thing here. I'm pleased to say that Wilks are offering a 5% discount to Refit and Sale viewers on their website now. If you contact them and use the code SBB5, you will get a 5% discount on your order. So thanks very much to Wilks Engineering and Machinery for your support, both on this episode and for offering that discount. Back to the boatworks. One of the things you may have noticed when I pulled this pad off that was kind of here a little bit earlier is I drew around it with a pen first, and that is because I need to make sure that I do every area of the hull, and because of the shape of the hull and because of the shape of my pads, sometimes I have to overlap pads and bits get done twice and what have you, but the essential thing is that everywhere gets done at least once. And you can see, because I've drawn little arrows, I've done that square there, I've done that square there, but and I've done from there up, but this bit of hull here hasn't yet been done. So I'm going to stick that small vac pad on here. Sometimes when I'm doing this, I have the vac pad coming down and hanging off the end of the boat. It's just the way you've got to do it, because you know the shape of the hull means that I want the vac pad to sort of finish here, but it's going to sort of hang down there. And this bit above, if it gets done a second time, it doesn't matter in the slightest. It just means that bit of hull is going to be extra dry, which is nice. Because I'm going to seal it along the bottom here, the vac pad, the vac tape that I've just put around the pad isn't actually going to touch. I shouldn't have put it on, but I hadn't quite planned where I was going to put it. So I'm going to run some vac tape directly on the hull all the way down here. So once the pad's on, I can push the pad into the vac tape and hopefully get a good seal. Before I stick the pad on the hull, let's have a quick look at the vacuum equipment that I'm using. I have one of these per pad. So this is the vac pump. It is a fairly small vac pump. My preference is to have multiple small vac pumps rather than one big one. The reason for that is, well, one, they're cheaper, and so when they go wrong, when you have a problem with one, they're easier to replace. This is more than enough to run 2 or 3 pads if I wanted it to. A vacuum is a vacuum at the end of the day. It doesn't need multiple pumps. However, when you're first pulling the air out of the pad, this is not got a huge amount of speed at which it pulls out the air, if you like. That's the only downside of using small pumps, but in reality I've not found that to be a problem. Off the vac pump, I have this thing which is a catch pot. Now, you'd normally use a catch pot if you're doing resin infusion and things like that, because any additional resin that you've pulled out of the laminate that you're vacuuming down, you want it to go into a catch pot and not into your vac pump. I'm not obviously doing resin infusion. I don't really need this as a catch pot for that purpose, but the reason I have it in here is because it has a gauge on it, and the gauge is absolutely essential in me seeing that I've got a vacuum being pulled. And then off of that, I have the hose that then goes off to the pad. So I'm going to move my vac pump round so it's a bit closer to where I'm going to be working, and then we'll get the pad on. Right, let's get this pad on. The temperature sensor is there because obviously I don't want the temperature sensor hanging in free air. There is a fridge unit behind here, but having done that pad and that pad, I don't think the installation of the fridge is an issue. I don't think it's against the hull. I can't actually see in there, but it sounds pretty hollow compared to the rest of the boat, and none of these pads have overheated, so I'm feeling pretty safe in doing it. The plan is to get this on somewhere just about there. That's it, pretty much in position. in case you're wondering, this is a 500 watt pad. My larger ones are 1200 watts. Arguably, the larger ones could do with being slightly more powerful because they sometimes take a while to get up to temperature, whereas this one gets up to temperature really, really quickly. So I could probably get away with 400 on this one, and maybe 1500 on the bigger ones. But you know, I had to design and specify these pads. They're not an off-the-shelf thing that you can buy. There is a company that you may or may not be aware of called HotVac, who sell a complete system. That's a very expensive system for me as an independent boat fixer, so I have made my own system up and I've designed my own system that works in exactly the same way. But of course, the downside of that is I had to design it myself, and there's a little bit of learning that goes on with that. But generally speaking, I've been very happy with how this works, and it definitely does the job of drying out the whole laminate. Right, that is now on. All I need to do is get some vacuum going and check for leaks. So, stick the hose on, Alexair, vac pump on, and then I've got to work around the edges, and that's already pulled a vacuum, I think. Heat pad is now on. This is the little infrared temperature sensor that I was talking about, so I can pop this on and I can check for any hot spots. So that's reading 42, 45, 40, 39, 40, 42, and yeah, we're all good at the moment, but it is just coming up to temperature. In terms of temperature that I run these things at, typically it's around about 85 degrees, sometimes 90, sometimes a bit more. It depends really, because you've got to remember it isn't a one-to-one relationship between the temperature of the heat mat and the temperature of the laminate. There is some heat loss there. It's not the laminate that's going to be at 85 or 90 or 95, it's the heat pad that's going to be at that temperature, and the laminate itself is going to be somewhat cooler. I think that's quite a safe temperature. That's the temperature that I've always run it at. I certainly don't go any higher than that because you risk damaging the laminate. If you go over 100 degrees, 110 degrees, you're going to start potentially damaging the laminate. But 85 to 90 is a very, very safe temperature to run it at. And certainly I've not had any issues at that level. And 8 to 10 hours on the boat at that temperature under a vacuum, generally speaking, I'm finding the readings that I get before and after go from off the scale to very high to very, very acceptable. There may be the odd spot where I have to put it on a second time and run it for a bit longer, but on the whole, once all around, certainly on this boat so far, has been more than enough to get the numbers down to where we want them. Whilst this is heating up and I'm monitoring it, let's talk a little bit about different ways that you can dry the whole laminate. One very obvious way is you peel it, you then just let it air dry. You do need to do regular washing. I've already talked about that, I think, in the previous video, because that helps wash off the surface, because the salts and the materials that you're trying to remove out of the laminate come to the surface as they dry, and then they dry on the surface. And if you don't remove those contaminants, it slows down the drying. So that's why when we peeled it, we washed it every day for the first week, and then the second week we washed it every other day approximately, and for the third week, before it came round to my workshop here, we were washing it every sort of third or fourth day, and then it got a final wash before it came round. And as I said, we're not just removing salt water from the laminate. Yes, it's obviously been sat in the sea and it's largely salt water that is absorbed into the laminate, but the reason it has been absorbed to some extent is because there are hygroscopic components within the resin, within the layup, that help promote sucking in that moisture. And what we're trying to do is try and remove as much of them as possible whilst we're doing the drying of the laminate. So it's obviously not going to be possible to remove all of those hygroscopic components that were in the resins when they were first made, but we will try to remove as much as possible, whilst also removing the moisture as much as possible, to get it down to a nice, safe, recoatable level that is going to give us the best result in the long term. One of the questions that came up on the previous video is this a once and once only job? It can be, or it can't be. It really depends is the answer. It depends how dry you can get the laminate. The drier you can get it, the better chance you've got of keeping it dry in the long term and not having an osmosis issue in the future. The second element of that is how well you can seal up and what you use to seal up the hull after you've got it dry, and that's why I try and do what I call kind of a gold standard job. So once this is dry, we will lay up a couple of layers of biax glass all over it. I could probably get away with one, but because I did quite a deep peel on this, I'm going to put two on, and I'll be laying up that glass with epoxy. Then I'll be filling and fairing the surface with an epoxy based filling and fairing compound, and then after it's all beautiful, I'll be then putting an epoxy based barrier coat on the top of that as well. So every layer that we're putting back on this polyester hull until we get back to the anti-fouling layer will be epoxy based, and because you're putting epoxy on top of epoxy on top of epoxy, and then ultimately we're talking about putting copper coat on this, I think the owner wants as well, which is kind of an epoxy based anti-fouling. We are going to be doing as much as we possibly can to put a really waterproof barrier back on the hull before it goes back in the sea. Now, because I don't plan these videos, I think I went a bit off topic when I was talking about the drying. You can dry a hull just by air drying it. The problem is, particularly in the UK where it's not particularly warm and not particularly dry a lot of the time, we have quite a humid atmosphere here, is it will take a very, very, very long time. So you could peel a boat, you could leave it out in the open, and it might take a year, or it might even take 18 months out in the open air with regular washing to get the whole laminate moisture readings down to an acceptable level. And now for some people that's absolutely fine, particularly if you're doing a DIY job and you want to save money. You can stick it in the corner of a yard, monitor it and let it dry, and maybe you can do other works on your boat whilst the hull is drying out. That is one option. It's not my favourite option. The second option is you could simply use heat on the surface in the form of infrared heat lamps or something like that to heat up the surface. You'd probably want to tent the boat in, but that is incredibly wasteful. It's incredibly expensive on electricity, and because you're not directing the heat directly on the hull as easily as you can with this, it's just a bit wasteful, and again it can take a very, very long time because you're not pulling a vacuum to help the process. And that's why I've gone to the effort of buying all of this kit, because this is the most effective and the fastest way, and I think the most efficient way electrically and cost-wise to dry out a hull. You're pulling a vacuum which lowers the boiling point of all the stuff you're trying to get out. You're heating up directly onto the laminate, and I'm going to put some insulation on this as well in a minute to make it as efficient as possible, because otherwise I'm just heating up the atmosphere in the area where I work, which is not a bad thing because it's a cooler day today, but I'd rather the heat went into the hull, and that saves on my power bills as well. Let's get this on. Simple household insulation that you might put behind a radiator or on a garage door or anywhere really. It's cheap. If it gets damaged, it doesn't really worry me. In fact, I've got that on the wrong way round. Let's put it that way round. And I can just hold it in place with a bit of masking tape. Now, I've been doing these videos long enough to know that I have to say like and subscribe, but I also know that some people are going to be asking how I'm going to do under these cradle pads, and it's quite simple. I can do that in one of two ways. Normally I would take these out with some temporary supports in to stop the boat from falling over, so you need some really strong supports in, and then you can wind these out and do underneath. At the moment I've done up to that side, I've done up to there on that side, and I've done up to there underneath it, so I can pull that out and just do that little square there. What I'm actually going to do on this boat is I've ordered some extra long legs here so that I can have these legs all the way up here on the top sides, and that is going to make it basically easier, not just for doing the drying, but also when it comes to relaminating all the hull, I'll be able to do the whole of the hull without having to stop and work around legs, whether they're temporary supports or whether they're the proper cradle pads. So those aren't going to turn up for another week or so, but that's fine because I've got plenty of drying to do on the boat whilst I'm waiting for my extra long legs to turn up. Round on the other side now, and you can see I've taken the insulation off of these two heat pads that we're working on Friday, so I'm going to pull these off and then I'm going to put one back in here. It is obviously going to overlap two areas that have been done already, and then I'll move one of the other pads over to here. Hopefully you can see that, and get that one working as well, and slowly working my way around the whole of the boat. Before I put the next pad on, let's have a quick look at the moisture meter readings using my Tramex. This is a Skipper Plus. There is a newer version of this around now, but there's also other moisture meters available that are used on glass fiber hulls. This area here has been dried, this area here has not. So I'm going to pop this on the area there, and you can hear the alarm going off because the readings are high. So that is reading 60 on the comparative scale, or 20 on the top numbers if you're used to using these meters. So that is already lower than it was before I peeled the boat. If I go over here, it's reading next to 0 actually. Let's move it around. That's reading about 5. That's reading about 15 on the comparative. That's reading about 20. That's reading nothing. That's reading nothing. Go back to there. High, high. That one's a little bit lower there, and that's up to about 40 there. So you can see the difference between the area that has been dried and the area that has not. Well folks, it is yet another day here in the S&S drying shed, and it's kind of Groundhog Day again. I have turned up, I have moved the heat pad, and it is going again. One of my larger heat pads is over on the table here, so the rudder has been dried once with the heat pads. Lots of horrible stuff came out. Yesterday, guys next door were pressure washing a car, so I took it out there and borrowed their pressure washer for a minute and just squirted it all over, because it saved me the time and effort of getting my pressure washer out, and I'm cooking it a second time under the heat pad because it is still very, very wet. On the moisture meter, there is a strong possibility that I'm not going to get the laminate in that as dry as the hull, because like most rudders, it's probably been waterlogged for a lot of, if not all of its life, and so completely drying out that laminate down to very low moisture meter readings is potentially going to be virtually impossible. It's likely to be the same in here. I strongly suspect that this skeg was waterlogged. It was absolutely full of water and has been for the last 50 years. So actually drying out that laminate such that you get really low readings is going to be very difficult, if not impossible. But what we will try and do is get the surface and as deep as we can into laminate as dry as possible before we then recoat it. Well folks, it's been a couple of weeks since I recorded anything on this video because I was waiting on these things here to arrive. I now have my extra long arms for my cradle. I put some temporary supports in, swapped one arm at a time for the longer arm, and as you can see, it sits up on what is now new gel coat. This was old gel coat when I last shot anything for this video. This is going to be the subject of another video, but effectively this is 6 coats of gel coat that have been applied over the top of the old gel coat, so we can refinish it and make it look chef kiss perfect, but you're going to have to wait for that. What I can now obviously do is get my heat and vacuum pads working on the hull. I am currently doing opposite corners diagonally across the boat. I tried to do the 2 aft pads at the same time, but one was pushing off the other pad, so I couldn't get it to draw a vacuum on both sides at the same time, which was very annoying. I faffed with it for a while and then gave up and decided I'll just get 1 quarter done. So I've got the port quarter being done, and now this is the starboard side front pad, and then tomorrow I'll be able to swap them over. All being well, because I've already done some secondary drying on the other side, all being well, once this is done, we'll be able to get the boat out of here, give it a pressure wash, and move on to the next stage, which is to lay up some glass on this hull to rebuild the surface and start getting it back to the shape and strength that it will be once it's delivered back to the owner. Well folks, today is actually quite an important day because the pads are in their final position. I've got one on the starboard quarter and one on the port bow, just up here underneath the cradle pad, or where the cradle pad was when it was still attached. And because I'm on that final stage, I've just been going over the hull again with this moisture meter. So earlier in this video you saw me using my Tramex skipper to go all over it. I was very lucky, a friend of mine sold me his used Sovereign Quantum. What's particularly nice about this meter is with the deep and shallow setting, you can see what's going on the surface, just sort of 1 or 2 mil into the laminate. But if you click it onto deep, you can also see what's going on deeper into the laminate, which you can't do with my other meter. So I've just been kind of going over this and checking out the numbers at most of the hull, to be honest with you. I need to be careful about rubbing this against the surface because glass fibre is quite abrasive. I'm going to wear the pad out. I should really just place it. But if I stick it on here, for example, I'm getting early 20s, kind of 22, 19, 20, 17 there. If I click it onto deep, I'm getting 17 on deep and 16 on deep, 17 on the shallow. Here, 20 on the shallow, 20 on the deep, as it turns out. I'm just going over it. I've done this both sides. Starboard side is drier than the port side. The port side was the one that was more blistered, but I'm not sure how much drier I'm actually going to be able to get it. Here we are on the port side. You can see that pad is doing its job just there. And if I put this on here, actually in this spot it's actually lower, so we're on 17. I don't know if you're going to be able to see that. That's reading nothing. That's reading nothing. Yeah, curious. Back to 17, 16, 18, 17. All pretty low numbers, certainly numbers that I'm very happy to recoat over. But certainly other areas of this side are not quite as dry. They're kind of in the mid to late 20s in places. Let's see if I can find a spot. Oh no, 18 again. Lid is closing on me. Hopefully you can see what that is saying. That's on the shallow reading. Essentially what I'm doing is just double checking there's no really kind of wet spots, and to be honest with you, I'm not really finding any wet spots that need doing again. I've already had the heat pads on some areas of the hull a second time. There were just 1 or 2 spots that I wasn't quite happy with, so I'm pretty much going to call it done, I think, once this session of drying today is finished. One area that unfortunately still has fairly high moisture readings is the skeg here. I'm pretty sure that this has been waterlogged. It has been dried as best I can, but if I stick the meter on there, we're kind of getting 37, 34, 31, 20. It's not so bad higher up. Down at the bottom here, pretty wet. Well, it's not wet compared to how it was because it was off the scale, but you know, we've gone from readings of off the scale to readings of, on average, mid-30s. I could keep drying this. I don't think it's going to get actually any drier in terms of the readings I'm going to get. But up here, 17, 19, 20, 18, they're all perfectly acceptable, dry, relatively speaking, dry readings for the hull. Exciting day today. I finally get to remove these pads for the very last time. I'm going to pull this one off, pull that one off, quickly chuck the moisture meter on it, and if, as expected, it's nice and dry, I will be wheeling the boat out of the unit today, getting it pressure washed, pulling it back in, then we're going to give it a few days to kind of air dry again before we can lay up some glass on the bottom of this boat. Why are we washing it yet again, you might be wondering? That's because there will be contaminants on the surface, so we've been using heat and vacuum to dry out the laminate, to pull the seawater effectively out of the hull, but also to pull out as many of those horrible nasty chemicals which are hygroscopic and have been pulling the seawater into the hull through osmotic action. So we want to get as much of that off as possible and get the surface as clean as possible and then as dry as possible. Remember, this is just going to be surface washing, so 2-3 days, leaving it in a nice dry environment like in here, and it will be ready to accept some new glass. We'll have a quick look. So on the Tramex, if I switch that on, make sure it's on GRP, it's recording 11, 3, 0, 10, 8, nothing, 12-ish, right, that's that. I'm happy with that. All in the green. Let's stick this one on, the old sovereign meter. This is on the calibration, this is slightly overreading at the moment, but that's on 16, 19, 17, 14, a bit higher, about 20, 17, 18, 19. So all in the teens like the rest of the hull, so I'm pretty happy with that. The interesting thing is it's all about comparison. I'm going to put this up on the top sides now, and I know what it's going to read. 17, 18, because I did this yesterday. So the top sides, which have been, well, obviously they haven't been submerged in water, are reading high teens, and below the waterline we are reading, generally speaking, high teens. So the bottom is, on the whole, just as dry as the top sides. So as a comparison, the bottom, as far as I'm concerned, is dry enough to re-laminate. And yeah, I think we just need to get it done. We've got the boat out as far as we are going to take it out for washing. I just don't want a huge amount of water sitting on the floor of my workshop, but it's also quite hard work moving it. So we're leaving the top wheels at the top of the ramp and the bottom wheels are obviously outside. To be honest, ideally I'd rather have the boat out a little bit further. We are going to get a bit wet in the workshop, but I'm not going to do anything in here for a couple of days, then it's the weekend, and by next week it'll all be bone dry and we'll be able to do some more work on the boat. And just like that, the boat is back in the shed. It was quite hard work, so we moved the boat in and out using chain blocks, one at the front and one on the rear. Helps us to control it as it goes down the ramp onto the ground outside. It's not particularly hard to move. In fact, when there isn't a boat in the cradle, I can push the cradle around just by hand, but obviously with 5 tons of weight sitting in the cradle, you need something to move it. I'm seriously considering putting some electric winches onto the cradle so that I can hook it onto the strong points around the workshop and maneuver it by pressing buttons, because I'm not getting any younger and it is pretty hard work moving the boat around just using chain blocks, but it is very controllable. That is very nice. It feels very safe doing it like that. I put some extra supports in, some extra props under the hull of the boat just whilst I was moving it around, because the pads are obviously on the side of the boat. I probably don't need those props, but I felt happier moving the boat up and down the ramp, particularly with those extra supports in. I've taken those off now because obviously I want the hull to completely dry, and before I do anything more with it, I will put my moisture meter on it just to check the surface moisture that I've put on there from washing has completely dried. And what happens next? Well, you're going to have to wait for that, because that will be the subject of the next episode in this osmosis treatment. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed that. I hope you've learned something. If you have, do remember to give me a thumbs up down below. And if you'd like to see more of this boat, then hit the subscribe button, then you'll get notified when the next episode comes out. I think you have to subscribe and hit the bell icon. I have to say like and subscribe, it is the YouTube. And also, finally, a very big thank you to those of you that support the show using the PayPal link that is down in the description. Those of you that support the show with your donations genuinely do help keep the lights on here at Refit and Sale. You pay for cameras, microphones, SD cards, storage, software, and all the things that I need to make this all happen. So thank you very much from me. This is obviously the wind up into Christmas. If you're starting to feel festive, then I wish you a very Merry Christmas, but hopefully I'll get some more episodes out between now and the big day when the fat man comes down the chimney. Anyway, that's enough from me. I will see you again very soon here on the intervals, here in the SBB Boat Shed. See you soon. Bye for now.